together. So, like thinking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specifically, it's interesting that you mentioned firing quickly, because that's something which we generally always associate with striking, unless it's with takedowns. You know, obviously firing your posterior chain quickly. Yeah. If I'm doing like a big suplex or something like that, and a suplex is a perfect example. You know that is in wrestling, and that's like it's perfect triple extension. It's the only takedown that has that kind of perfect triple extension, and then we think we have to fire our posterior chain quickly. Greg and I were just doing the B skip before Sigurd the Blue Belt Slayer arrived here, and I'm just dying on every level. And again, it's because, you know, movement pattern deficit. So I think, but obviously something which we could talk about now is there might be disagreements, so we can encourage a little bit of trench warfare, but I think we're mostly on the same page here. Is just in particular, just talking a little bit about preferable exercise selection for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because there is a vast variety of stuff, and ultimately it's something that we have to get into to some degree, because we're talking about it a little bit broadly and a little bit broadly for approach. But obviously I want to some degree tailor this video to your hobbyist and even your competitive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys who want to have a little bit of freedom to play around with their strength and conditioning work and want to have some ideas as well. Because I think something I was saying to Greg is that we have these programs that we run for sports that have mixed energy systems, and we know that they work. But the interesting thing is that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu really is a very young sport. You know, you can't argue that it's not something, and at least in global participation, it's still very new. You know, it's still one of the only sports where we talk about that. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it's mentioned a lot with John Dana and those guys, like the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu audience, like 95% with something ridiculous of the spectators themselves are participants. So it's not a sport that is necessarily open to a broad range. You know, MMA, UFC, the majority of people don't participate in MMA themselves. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, almost everyone who watches and knows about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they participate in the sport. And that's why, you know, for this video, actually throwing out the ideas of certain exercise selection might be a good idea. So I want to ask, let's ask about the view first, because we've touched on the importance of particularly patterning. But these days, like the trend which I got into, these days the big trend coming from like the power building scene is very much just your big six compounds. Yeah. And people will train your big six compounds, and then they will, like this is my approach, right? Or used to be. And then you just have muscular endurance and cardio that you throw on top of that. Yeah. And then you just get stronger at vertical push, vertical pull, you know, horizontal push, horizontal pull, squat, deadlift. Yes. And that's it. And obviously eventually I kind of realized, like, one, these movements are so compound that they are frying my ability in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And also there are certain areas where, and I spoke about this with Greg, like, a horizontal push, I don't really need max strength here. I actually need some really good muscular endurance, because that's what's going out on a roll. You know, not just having a huge bench is actually helping me at all. Exactly. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, because that's, you know, that's a trend of the past few years.
Yes, I suppose the best place to start is having numbers like a bench or a deadlift could contribute towards being able to assess the individual, and then through the assessment, you know, program for the individual's function, you know. Right. So that kind of is supposed to be the standard, but in a real world that happens very, very seldom. You know, where something else to consider, I think it's more than just movements. Let's use a strict press, for example. 3 sets of 3 strict press.
It's not like military of it.
Yes, that's it. 3 sets of 3. And you're going heavy enough with the 3-second down tempo. It's a very different dose response than a set of 12 reps with the same tempo, but reps different. Yeah. So there, the program designer needs to have a degree of understanding actually what you're trying to achieve, and then over time, one will get a little bit more accurate and appropriate with that.
Right.
But yet, I'm a big believer in balanced fitness. So I want to be able to jump, I want to be able to, you know, function really well. I want to feel strong. Want to be able to, you know, on every single aspect, fitness, power, and so forth. So that's kind of my thinking behind training. Like I said, there's certainly also the dose responses required in squats.
Yes.
It could be very different depending on what you're trying to achieve.
Yes.
But it's very hard to just throw up. It's really just.
Might also depend on the athlete.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, but again, you got to be able to bend nice and heavy, nice and long. I don't like testing 1 rep maxes unless it's a competitive athlete.
Yeah.
And it'll be a 5 rep max.
Yeah.
Would probably be better towards BJJ, and then training towards that rather than a 3 rep max maybe. But putting yourself under stressors, that's not really going to be relevant. So I think that's a big thing. So once your assessment is in place, and that'll allow you to train for that. So so I suppose that's a pretty good place to start. I would think to be able to train towards and perform a really good 5 rep max back squat, 4 or 5 reps deadlift, really good. Pull-ups, max reps, max weight, 1 rep max, etc. All of those contribute.
I'm a big fan of weighted chin-ups.
Yes, same. Yeah. So regarding pulling, I like to just have different dose responses. So really anaerobic heavy response, maybe an isometric pull, and then a light left-right pull throughout the week. Again, it's really hard
to broadly talk, but the one thing which I think we're getting at is that there might be situations in exercise selection where you also just get better bang for your buck.
Yes.
You know, something that does a few things. And this is something which I know we spoke about where I wanted to, I was wondering like, oh great, can't I just spend the time learning Olympic lifting? And your take on that was like, well, you know, what I want you doing, and for all the other shit that we have to do, you know, like a trap bar jump with good triple extension will probably cover the same bases without all these things that have to go on top of it. So
this is a massive thing in
maybe you can obviously touch on what
in the strength and conditioning world, isn't it? It's always been about, and you've seen it now for a long time. I mean, certainly since I qualified in 2005, right the way through till now, which obviously probably before that and whatever. That it's this idea of if you're doing a top standard strength and conditioning program, you need to have Olympic lifting. It will improve this, it will improve that. Well, it's like but what is it about the Olympic lifting that actually the technique in the Olympic lift is not what makes you good. It doesn't and has the carryover. What has the carryover is on jumping with weight.
Exactly.
That's
and supporting properly and jumping. So the aspect is it's not the snatch itself.
It's not. It's not the actual. So for me, why am I going to spend this amount of time to get that techers dead right where you're safe, and I can actually get the load up that I want to on you for those kind of drills or whatever whatever my assessment is then shown. When actually, like you said, I can actually get you doing trap bar jump, or I can get you doing like I can break it down in a rack pull rather than
hang power snatch. Squat snatch.
Exactly. So
to the subject.
So another classic is again this idea that for a deadlift I have to get my hips into a certain position, this, that, and that, and it's like, well, actually, no. If I've got an individual that's really struggling with that mobility to actually get into a decent position without completely rounding off and flexing his back or collapsing his knees or whatever it is that the issue that this particular athlete has, it doesn't mean I can't train those aspects. So I used to do that. I'd be like, no, if I can't get in that position, I'm not going to train it. Then I thought actually that's wrong, because the mobility piece is a separate issue. I mean, they all come together, granted, in the performance, but technically it's a separate issue. So okay, let's do rack pulls.
Can give you something that you can perform.
I can still load you right up in those ranges and that whole piece. So that's very much something. But definitely going back to your I think the assessment is that's the thing I'm massive on as well. Saying if you need to. So this is why it is a tricky question, like you say. Actually, what should and shouldn't we do? Who are we talking about?
Yes, I almost think good assessments would be an easier subject to then the exercises to get to.
That's an interesting thought.
Yes,
because it's going to that is what sets your roadmap.
Yes.
So people get a bit put off by me sometimes. I might spend 2 or 3 days testing.
Yes.
Depending, definitely a day minimum, like a whole day. And I remember working with other sports teams, and they were always like, "Oh, it's a lot of testing, man. I was hoping we could get done in the morning." And I was like, "Right, hold on."
Yeah.
You could. That is an option. You know?
Right.
Of course, it's an option. I can, but I'm going to give you this amount of data, which is going to allow me to
More
program
data,
that much of a program. You know,
Yeah,
right, or whatever. You know? And then that is basically what you're going to do. Is you're going to say, actually, the testing is just basically to say that we tested. And then what you're going to do is you can go and do what you said you wanted to do anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, which is actually missing the point, because you can go and do all this stuff, and that's absolutely fine. And will you see gain in those particular areas? Yeah, you will, but where were the areas that they were most lacking?
Exactly.
Right.
Was here, you haven't done any of that because you haven't tested it, because you know they were lacking,
Exactly.
or whatever.
Yeah.
So the degree that we have, sorry, I'm going to get you right now. To the degree that we can have a like general,
Keep talking. Yeah.
to the degree that we can have, general mobility assessment, and maybe we have certain mobility that might, I'm thinking overall about testing now. We have patterning testing, and the patterning stuff that you perform, there is no specific patterning requirement for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, as opposed to just global human movement patterning themes that you want to assess.
Yeah, so when I'm doing it, so there'll always be the five base movement patterns for me, which will always be working from core to distal. So basically how your brain splits up your body. So top from bottom, left from right, front from back, close to far, and then across lateral.
Yes.
So those are the ones that will, so that's basically so if you had to draw out a great big, or well, like I say, the theories that I work to along certain lines, which is allied with SAQ and other things which I've touched on in my studies and whatever, is that you're then going to have this sort of like hierarchy. So if you then start taking these sort of trees of movement patterns that then are going to come from each of those base movement patterns, if I'm missing one of those blocks, then there's this whole chunk of tree that we're missing kind of idea. That's kind of like how I work. Then on top of all of that, once you've achieved certain levels, then what you'll do is you'll say, right, okay, now we're going to look at the sport specific.
Yes.
I'm going to say, okay, because I can achieve this, this, and this. So classic is a run assessment. A run assessment is actually, guys are you're not running BJJ, so why don't you keep looking at running? Because it says how you wired. Because it's so fundamental to how we, so
To being a human,
to being a human. So it's this, again, it's exactly that. It's human first, then athlete, then sport specific.
Right.
That's again my kind of like trainings. I work up a hierarchy. So can you do normal? So for example, again going back to like the rehab idea, if I can't put the canopy beans into the top shelf because my shoulder's so smashed, well, it doesn't matter about anything else, because actually
Remember who I choked last night?
it doesn't matter. I'll pull off my brand new maneuver on whoever. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't really matter, because the bottom line is, however you're now going to then work from that segment doesn't work with the body, so therefore you will compensate. Now that's obviously a really easy example where it really is hurt, and I really can't do something really basic. But
You'd be surprised how many jiu-jitsu athletes though walk around with that shit. Like
Yeah, right.
every weathered purple belt you'll speak to them, that's why they skip warm-ups. They don't want to embarrass themselves. They're
They're
fried.
Yeah,
But they still manage to do the sport, but they're fried.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like-
I feel that's why we're very lucky with Steve. He has a little bit more of a mature mindset. I find SBG in general, which I appreciate, having come from a place where it was valued how hard people can work. Yes, so I
It's
think we're lucky with that, especially with, again, I mentioned the tough nature. That is very much the draw point. But again, there needs to be a balance, because you and I were pushing 40. We can't see.
You can't just fry it.
Yeah, exactly.
Very bored child, sorry.
No, all good.
Very bored child. So you're gonna have some hand dragons and
Hell yeah.
That's
Keeps our audience around.
people involved. Yeah.
So but the thing which I wanted to touch on is that, when we're assessing the athlete, and this is now going to get into the selection, now I want to kind of bring this a little bit full circle on this, is that if we, once we've done mobility, movement assessments, and we know
sport specific.
once
we're actually at the sport
once we're at the stage, so let's start, we're going to get to sort of aerobic and cardio stuff now, but let's start the big one, which is that, again, we're talking now about this strength, this trend of big compound movements, and that's like,
and they're valuable.
they are valuable,
I like
100%, and I do exactly, because the thing is that everyone, I think these days are also, they're also recognizing, like with beginners in the gym, you hear it all the time, like, obviously this is for, now for like young kids my age, and they want to get huge, and they're saying don't fuck around with the machines, get really strong, and cool, perfect. But the issue is that, and the reason why I'm talking about this now is that there are going to be so many entry-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes who just getting stronger are going to take the same approach for themselves, and it's something that we look at in the realm of exercise selection is in the medium of like absolute strength to where it touches into muscular endurance, right? So we know roughly that territory, and now we think of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's that question of what kind of strength do we need? And now that's almost a whole podcast in and of itself.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important thing to touch on for these, you know, like what kind of base strength are we going to need for the sport that we're going to do, which isn't a strength sport, but having that in the gas tank is useful.
So, so look, for me, I've been playing a lot with, so since I started with Jiu-Jitsu, I've been playing a lot with certain banded activities and adjusting more standard compound activities. So I never used to do sumos. Then I actually started thinking about, well, actually, generally speaking, if I'm in certain positions that involve a hip hinge type activity, I tend to have my hands on the inside and legs on the outside, right? I just thought about it in those terms.
Yeah.
And
single legs.
do you know what I mean? Like,
high
exactly. Yeah,
crotch.
we tend to be in that wider base, or if I'm over the guy, or or again those sort of positions. I'm usually in some sort of wider split stance type position. Now that's not to say that's not to say again that
a beginner, we might not want to start with conventional just to teach.
Yeah, but then even that, then I started thinking about it. I go, well, why not actually? Because actually, can I maintain a stable spine? Can I hip hinge correctly? Have I got the range of motion at my ankle? You know, that still applies to sumos as much as it does standard deadlift. So then I started thinking, actually, would I go straight into, you know what I mean? I started sort of playing around these ideas.
Right.
And I'm still not sure exactly what I think about it. But look, I know for me certainly that my power in that wider range is again part of my issues around groin flexibility. And again, why we quite often it's quite normal for lasses to prefer the sumos, and that's generally because they
better hip mobility.
It's really comfortable for them. And actually, a lot of folks don't like sumos if they don't have the right groin mobility because it tends to plantar flex, and like pronate them. And anyway.
Jokes and then do high kicks.
Yeah. And then and the other
jokes and
then she'll tire out on it. She won't. And then the other one was about banded type activity. So I know we've been talking a little bit about this again, and I don't know how you feel about this, but again, I'm just sort of experimenting with it. I'm thinking a lot around. We're trying to load up the end of the lever, right? So I've been doing a lot of kind of stuff like banded, like as in from the neck, tethered down deadlifts, or lifts, or squats, or lunges, or any of those sort of standard type maneuvers, but from basically a collar tied position. And sometimes changing the force vectors slightly, getting it more off to a side or this side or that, or making it more dynamic, doing like sort of split lunge type, dynamic split lunge type sort of things, but tethered at the neck. And that's been quite interesting, and I've quite enjoyed it. It's definitely cheap as the fatigue on it goes up.
Because there's that sudden concentration and change.
Yes, again, my balance is being affected, my proprioception is being affected. Just I feel that the lines of force are better. And again, I'm talking. So this would be again, look, if a guy can't do a standard deadlift or he can't do more of the sort of standard stuff that you say like you test for, I think maybe those areas would still need a little bit of work on. First.
But I like that.
If we're looking at that top slice of pure. Sort of sport specific. Then that's definitely where the sort of stuff which I'm enjoying playing with at the moment. But yeah.
I have never tried that, but just listening to it, I like that. Well, obviously, foundation's got to be in. Person's got to be aware enough in the movements normally. But being off center, being off balance certainly would contribute towards expressing movement under those circumstances on the mat. I can definitely see that. Nice, I like that.
Well, it makes sense because often, when we are driving from the lower body, in a barbell lift, our upper body's unaffected.
Yes.
But we realize that all the time when we're driving from the lower body in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we're attached to someone and they're attached to us
in some way.
And so there's this full body movement that now has to get applied. So, but obviously foundations are foundations. But okay, so like we touch on that as like one of our that is like one of our lower body. You know, you mentioned but you mentioned earlier back squats, and you like
Yes,
horse.
I like.
You dig that.
I like back squats and many different, all squats, Zercher squats, overhead squats, front squats, there's value in them, planning them out appropriately, which I'm also getting better at over time. That's really important. I think for anyone, you should be able to bend and stand up with the weight on top of you and do it well. Whatever, if it's a sandbag or if it's a concrete block on your dog or whatever. It's the best example I could get. See, I don't really have a lot of reference.
I can work those.
But you know, I think there's a lot, and just function. You know, I do agree with the notion that you would get more bang for your buck to not use the machines. Purely because it does a lot of the work for you, but that's nothing new with regards to my normal philosophy and how it relates to BJJ. To be quite honest, there's no real difference in my training philosophy and BJJ training for. It is just basically training for an individual's function, and that would kind of determine what you place a focus on and what you don't.
For sure.
But
look, in my take, I definitely noticed that something which look, I had some major squat deficits by that. It's why it's something which I'm working towards eventually loading again. But you know, in hindsight, lots of bug weight, bad ankle mobility, and also kind of weak quads and gluting my way out of the movement, which caused some of my tendonitis problems. But that's something which I'm working towards, you know, even if it's not a primary modality, but just having the ability to squat healthily could be something that's globally, you know, really useful, 100%. But something
you've got to be able to do that with a single leg as well.
Yes.
You know,
well, that's
to function.
Yes.
You know, so
that massive.
You want to be able to press overhead. You want to be able to press overhead single arm. You want to be able to hold and walk, even climb stairs. So it really just functions, you know, and applying, you know, a stressor related to that function, I suppose.
Well, it's I saw something on and I know you mentioned that you. I'm not sure if you mentioned that it was you that said you were the biggest fan, but on the Squat University page, he said something where he said, like, you know, it was an opinion post, and he basically said something like, if you back squat heavy, you should probably also, you should also have the ability to comfortably do a pistol squat to parallel on each side.
Okay.
And that was now it was up for grabs, and I think he wanted more experienced people, or not more experienced than him, but other people in the comments to talk about it. But it's something that I've been playing around with simply because of valgus collapse at the knees and things like that. That to the degree that I want to load it, having really nice single leg stability.
With the idea, I have to agree that if you can squat heavy, but you're not able to sequence and coordinate yourself into a split squat, for example, that shows that there's a lack in function, for lack of a better term, 100%. Related to you as a person. That's not a balanced way, not a balanced aspect of movement.
So many people come to mind.
So
you can back squat amazingly in it.
But I think it becomes dangerous when there's one specific movement that, alright, well, if we you to be considered a balanced athlete, you have to have a heavy squat and a pistol specific. That's when it becomes dangerous. So where I couldn't even do pistols when I was competing, I had to go on my toes and kettlebell infrared. But I can at least coordinate a split squat, you know, femur length, bone length, ankle mobility, etc. all plays a part.
So yeah, I think because of the mobility requirements in a pistol squat,
which is a high degree, you know, very high.
I would hasten to add that no, there's technically on paper.
It would be fantastic to have
that kind of makes sense. So cause I started thinking, first of all, I was talking about lateral systems. So I was thinking particularly, you know, QLs with you know, contralateral, you know, glute medius and mids. I'm thinking, right, you know, technically, if you've got a really decent heavy, a proper heavy squat, relative, you know, at least, right, up and above or whatever, that you have to have an element of balance around your hips. So this was the thing that I used to struggle with, and I still struggle with it a little bit now. It's much better than it used to be, but actually because I was so much tighter around one hip than the other, my issue with my squat, because I can never work it out, I was like, I can get on a hack squat machine and I can pump it. I know I've got good stability around my hips, because if I individually tested the hips, the stability was there, but one side was still tighter than the other.
Right. Yeah.
Right, which was actually a function of how I moved when I was in running type and low motor patterns or whatever, right? So now when I got into my bilateral squat position, I'd be going down, and actually the problem was my back. Now it didn't hurt my back, but I couldn't push through my back properly. I couldn't set the platform, and to look at it, it all looked nice and flat and blah. But actually what's happening was I'm corkscrewing. Right? And so my sacrum is actually corkscrewing because one hip's winding up more than the other. So this is the sort of thing that when you start saying that, I think, well actually, yeah, okay. Whereas actually, if the expression of having stable hips is that nice big squat, then yeah, maybe. But we also know there are plenty of guys that will still have a really decent squat, but fundamentally they're only driving off one leg.
Yeah.
We've all seen it, right?
Yes.
And you can't work out how he's lifting that much, but he is, or she is, whatever, and you think, geez, that's amazing. And then you test individual sides, and you just go, well, not using that leg, or very little of it compared to, and so when that lateral system isn't working, there could still be an element of, you're still going to see massive like valgus collapse and all this kind of stuff go on, even though they've got a big squat, because there just isn't the rotational component. There just isn't the rotational component of when you kind of go.
So this goes into testing almost, is that we recognize that these big bilateral movements are important, but then it's how are we going to test the athlete so that we're going to load them up on a squat, but then let's see how each leg flies.
Yeah, the term that I learned through OPEX is broccoli. You got to eat your broccoli. No one wants to eat broccoli, but friggin' important, So if you want to have a big deadlift, you want to have a big back squat, you got to be unilateral. You got to be able to lunge well. You got to be able to press with one arm and the other. So you got to do your broccoli. So it's not the big sexy lifts. You got to go do your dumbbell rows. But all of those contribute, and all of those play a valuable part. So again, it's not so much. I would argue it's not so much in a specific movement that you're able, but you want to be able. When I work with an athlete, you want them to become more capable. In movements, obviously function specific, but it doesn't matter who you are. You want a person to be better off, to have stable hips, to be able to coordinate their left and their right movements. So programming and stressing those specific functions appropriately depending on the person.
Yes.
I mean, a very good example just on assessments, why it's so hard to stand here and give just movements is one person you can test set max reps at 10 kilogram weighted pull-ups, where the next person, okay, how long can you keep your chin overhead? The dose response is going to be same. It's going to be hard enough for both person, and they're going to contribute towards the sport. But it's just the actual test is required to be appropriate.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
No, that makes sense.
Yes.
Anything you wanted to touch on that?
No, that's good. But I don't think, just to sort of summarise it, I don't think strictly speaking, having a massive squat will necessarily transfer over just for mobility alone.
Yes.
Just to summarise that question. I've seen guys that just can't get even close, and they're super strong guys. There's too much other stuff.
But I think the theme that it touches on is just having a balance, because the thing is that obviously we're on the absolute strength topic for now, but this is actually where I suppose it gets complicated to draw lines in the sand between things, because it's if your stability's off on particularly your single leg stability, and then you're wondering how you're driving. Well, one, you're cock blocking your max deadlift. But then two, if you're blasting away on your max deadlift, but maybe you're putting yourself in a position where you aren't stability required, well, then when we get in the gym, and then maybe I have to do a particular takedown, or I have to drive in a different way that isn't measured and perfectly unilateral, where I walk up to this thing, it suddenly becomes difficult. And so this is where I suppose it's have both. Not have both, but try and as best as possible go, okay, I'm gonna advantage myself as much as possible and get a reasonable lift, a
Yeah.
reasonable